Chris, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We
It's
ask
a
that you say a few words about our topic today, which is your book, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn, and then we'll go to questions.
pleasure to join you.
Well, thank you. Do you want to open with some opening comments?
Sure. And of course, having worked now for 14 years on researching and now publishing this biography of Woodrow Wilson, I'm all in for this discussion. Woodrow Wilson is a controversial president, but there's little controversy about his importance in American history and his enduring influence in the 21st century. Beyond his impact on U.S. foreign policy and the structure of the U.S. government, his personal story is also compelling. He died a tragic death from advanced arteriosclerosis and its complications almost exactly 100 years ago, 101 years ago in 1924. In the intervening century, he's been variously heralded as a progressive hero and vilified as a racist who kept black men out of Princeton and then, as President of the United States, segregated the federal workforce. To us in the 21st century, both of those characterizations ring true, but at the same time, they seem inconsistent. It's difficult to imagine how one can be a progressive hero and a white supremacist at the same time. But while that's true today, it was not true in Wilson's time. It's taken many decades for historians and academics to square this circle, and in the process, to discover who was the real Woodrow Wilson. And that work is still ongoing. For the first 50 years or so, Wilson's racism wasn't really even discussed, let alone his longstanding opposition to women voting, and especially his opposition to the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. In 1958, Arthur Walworth's two-volume Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Woodrow Wilson broached these topics, but only just. And it really wasn't until the 1990s that Wilson's views and policies on race and on gender began to be treated seriously. And even then, they weren't considered central to his presidency. It was really only in the academic literature that the entirety of Wilson's record in domestic and foreign policy was being reevaluated in light of these now well-known prejudices. What has emerged from that scholarship is a view of Wilson's international and domestic record that's shot through with racial bias. That's especially true when it comes to women's voting rights, which was the leading domestic policy issue that had reached a tipping point really by the time he arrived in Washington in 1913. Wilson opposed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment because it would bring with it federal enforcement of voting rights everywhere in the United States, including the Jim Crow states, where Black citizens were largely prevented from voting. So in this new biography of Wilson, the story centers on Wilson's changing attitudes and policies on women's rights, and in particular, his steadfast opposition to the Anthony Amendment until almost the bitter end. It's really quite something that one of the most significant events of the 20th century, and in fact, one of the greatest advances in the entire history of American democracy, which took place in the last year of Wilson's presidency, hasn't been part of the standard biographies. There was a Gallup poll taken at the beginning of the 21st century that asked the American public to name the most important event of the 20th century. 66% chose women gaining the right to vote. That was ahead of landing a man on the moon, the fall of the Soviet Union, World War I, the Great Depression. Only World War II ranked higher, and yet Wilson's biographers have never treated it that way. It's more than a lacuna in the Wilson story, it's a gaping hole. And it turns out this aspect of the Wilson story is really quite interesting. For starters, the suffragists, the people who fought against Wilson and those in Congress who didn't want women to vote, these are remarkable characters. And while Wilson may be the anti-hero in this story, these people of courage and these great leaders are the real heroes. They were men as well as women. Long before Wilson arrived on the scene, really for a full century, there was a growing number of Americans who'd been working for women's property rights, marital and family rights, and voting rights. And by the middle of the 19th century, they were already having considerable success. After the Civil War, when Republicans in Congress drafted the Reconstruction Amendments, women's voting rights were seriously considered for inclusion. That was true for both the 14th and the 15th Amendments. Thaddeus Stevens, who chaired the Joint House Senate Committee drafting the 14th Amendment, produced a first draft that included men as well as women in its protections for voting rights. In 1868, Senator Samuel Pomeroy of Kansas and Congressman George Julian of Indiana simultaneously introduced the first constitutional amendments dedicated solely to women's suffrage in both the House and the Senate. So this was really a Reconstruction initiative. It goes way back in American history. In 1878, Susan B. Anthony's good friend, California Republican Senator Aaron Sargent, introduced the language that is today part of the Constitution, guaranteeing the right to vote against all discrimination on account of sex. So there is this steadily growing number of men in Congress who supported and fought for the cause. And by the turn of the 20th century, that movement had reached a tipping point. So by the time Wilson arrives in Washington, D.C., and the day before his swearing in, there's an enormous parade in the streets of Washington by suffragists, demanding the right to vote and demanding specifically the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. This is a cause and a constitutional amendment that had decades and decades of force behind it, and now great popular support. So Wilson's arrival in Washington, D.C. was really not just the tipping point, but it was a time when this great advance for democracy was long past due.
Well, thank you for that overview. And it is an incredible book that you put together. And I just can't even imagine. You say you spend the past 10 to 15 years researching and writing this book.
Yeah, it
And
started in 2010.
yeah, so thank you. And I know Janine has got some great questions lined up. So Janine, I'm going to go to you.
Yeah. Hi, Mr. Cox.
Hello.
Nice to have you with us. Hi, I'm Janine Turner, founder of Constituting America. We all say our names because we go on the radio later and people need to know who we are. Thrilled to have you here today. And every, all answers kind of have to be really quick because I have so many questions. History is my thing. What is the purpose of your book? When you say the light withdrawn, are you trying to diminish Woodrow Wilson? Just tell us what's the purpose of the book?
So the light withdrawn is a line from a poem called Ichabod. It was written in the mid-19th century by an abolitionist poet, John Greenleaf Whittier, after whom, by the way, Whittier, California is named. He had long admired Daniel Webster's leadership, Senator Daniel Webster from Massachusetts, in the fight against slavery in the United States Senate. But shortly before Webster died, Webster broke faith with the abolitionists, and he broke millions of American hearts in the process because he supported the fugitive slave law at the center of the Compromise of 1850. And in response, Whittier published this poem, which is really a mournful elegy for his former hero, who once wore glory as a crown. These are now more words from the poem, and might have illuminated future ages. Those words seem to me to be especially appropriate for Woodrow Wilson as we're coming better to understand him. Whittier's counsel in this poem is to repress anger and rage when a leader that we've idealized shatters our hopes, and instead.
So are you saying your goal is to shed light so we have a more nuanced approach to who Woodrow Wilson was?
Yes. And in this book, because we're specifically focusing on the parameters of race and sex, Wilson does not fare well. There is, of course, more to the Wilson story, much more.
I'm a historian. I love history. I've written a book about women fighting for rights, holding her head high, exceptional women spanning 17 centuries. And they were enduring this era. And Belva Lockwood was one of the women who was fighting. I've written a musical about her, actually, that I'm getting to Broadway, and she was during Woodrow Wilson's era, and she actually would work with him to fight for the League of Nations. She used to he appointed her, and she was fighting for women's rights. She fought for the right to be admitted to the bar of the Supreme Court, and women are on the Supreme Court because of her. She ran for president in 1884. She's an amazing woman, but she would go for the League of, represent him with the League of Nations. And I was looking it up. The woman who starved herself was Alice Paul. I'm sure you're familiar with her, who was put in prison because she was trying to fight for women's rights to vote and whatnot. And it's interesting because Woodrow Wilson eventually, she was starving herself. She was on a hunger strike in jail, and Woodrow Wilson surreptitiously sent his people in and said, "What do you want?" And after that, Woodrow Wilson changed his mind and decided that he would fight for women's rights. It just took a long time. I think it's interesting. I'm not being pro or con Woodrow Wilson, but it's just it is interesting to me that Princeton still has the Woodrow Wilson Institute and the Woodrow Wilson degrees and all of this because of his fallibilities as a human in these areas, which is women's suffrage and with abolition, because it's pretty stark in how he was from the South. He was a Southerner. He lived through the Civil War, and he did not support rights for African Americans at the time, and so he is definitively fallible. Before we move on to all of his faults, though, I think that it was interesting because I've done a lot of research on Woodrow Wilson, in that what he tried to do in World War I, and he did have a big impact in raising the stature of America as a power in these conflicts, because in World War I, he wanted to make sure that we went in, helped win the war, so we'd be in a good negotiating process for his idea of the League of Nations. Whether you like it or not, he had a broader concept that he was focusing on, which was world peace. And of course, it was utopian. It's utopian today. It doesn't work, but that was his goal. And talk to us for literally like 60 seconds about this reception that he received in Europe. He was idolized in Europe as having helped them win that horrible, horrible war where people, just millions and millions and millions of people died. I studied this in college, right? And he would go over to England and to France to like a hero's welcome, like he had just landed on the moon. They really did revere him and what he was trying to do with his policy. And I think that's why Princeton has the Policy Institute, with his policy to try to bring peace to the world. And then I want to talk to you about how he ruined it all with Congress, with a check and balance. But can you talk about that for just a second?
Sure, sure. And just to pick up where you began, when Alice Paul was imprisoned for 7 months for allegedly crowding the sidewalk, which was an offense of which she was not guilty, and neither were any of her fellow protesters. She did not at first go on a hunger strike, but ultimately, because the physical abuse of the suffrage protesters was so horrible, she did go on a hunger strike. And Woodrow Wilson was personally involved in approving her force feeding, which at the time was a life-threatening procedure. And so the idea that President Wilson was willing to punish people who were exercising their First Amendment rights in this way, in this very brutal way, showed a different side of him, which we saw in his second term. He
did meet with her, but he did send his delegate, his kind of delegates to meet with her, and said, if you'll quit starving yourself, then we will help you. And I think he turned. I think Alice Paul is a heroine, because she did that and finally got Wilson to change his mind and say, okay, I will support you, but it took time for Congress to get it through. And Wilson was initially reluctant to support, but changed his position in 1918. He called for a special session of Congress to push the amendment through. Wilson delivered a speech to the Senate in September 1918, appealing to patriotic arguments for women's suffrage. The 19th Amendment was passed by Congress in June 1919 and ratified by the states August 18th. Wilson's change of heart was influenced by the brutal treatment of suffragists by police and jail guards. This treatment included arresting protesters. So he changed his mind. If it was passed through him, then he redeemed himself.
So one of the important parts of the story is, it's laid out in the book, is that even after Wilson jumped in front of the parade, he changed his mind very abruptly on the Anthony Amendment, literally the night before 2/3 of the House of Representatives voted to pass it. And of course, 2/3 of the House does not vote for something that's not already overwhelmingly popular. He then said nothing about the Anthony Amendment for the rest of the year until finally he spoke to the Senate.
Okay,
and
so
this was literally the first words that he ever uttered in favor of it. Is that even after he came out and said he was in support of it, he then sided with Southern Democrats who attempted to rewrite the Susan B. Anthony Amendment at the last moment to take away Section 2 of the amendment, which provided for federal enforcement. That would have allowed for white women only to vote, and that's what the chief sponsor of the amendment. That's what the chief sponsor of the amendment said.
And I'm glad you're bringing that to light. Okay, so because all women should vote, no matter of their race or color. So let's talk about though what he was trying to do with a broader perspective of policy for world peace. And then I need to toss this. So I want to ask you two more questions. One is his heroes' welcome in Europe. Can you talk about that? How much they loved and adored him in Europe because he was trying to do the League of Nations and bring peace, which failed because of his own ego, which I want to talk about. But let's talk about that for a second.
Yes, there were three things going on when Wilson went to Europe to lead the peace delegation in Paris, which no president had ever done before. No president had, in fact, left the country for more than a few days.
Yeah.
So Wilson was over there in Europe for 6 months at a time when transatlantic communication was, very primitive. We had, Morse code essentially via undersea cable, no transatlantic telephony and so on. So he was really cut off from what was going on in America during that time, which included trying to ratify the Anthony Amendment. And at the same time, he was focused intently on the League of Nations, which was the 14th of his 14 points. He arrived after the war to a hero's welcome because, first of all, the liberated nations of France and England in particular, and Italy, were very grateful for America entering the war on their side. Second, because there had been an enormous propaganda effort by something called the Committee on Public Information that had targeted, pro-war propaganda and pro-Wilson, very personally pro-Wilson propaganda all over Europe. And the third thing was that Italy, for example, but England and France as well, had territorial demands that they wanted to make in settlement of the war that ran counter to Wilson's 14 points. Wilson wanted a peace without victory, as he put it. He did not want a punitive peace. And they continued to press on this, but they wanted something from Woodrow Wilson. So one of the reasons that they had all of these ceremonies to drape medals around his neck and so on was that they were trying to butter him up. And ultimately, I'm not sure that tactic worked, but ultimately Wilson yielded on, after being very stubborn about it for some time, he yielded on many of these territorial demands and put all of his chips on the League of Nations and the other nations.
Yeah, and that's what I want to talk to you about, because I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating how he ruined that, his big dream with the checks and balances in Congress. But, it's interesting what you say about the fact that they wanted something from him and they wanted him to be more punitive than he wanted to be. And, I think that Woodrow Wilson, I agree and concur with what you're saying, is that his racism and his not he didn't believe in women's right to vote were real stains upon his character. So I'm concurring with you there. But I do think he was correct in World War I to not be punitive, because it was that punitive nature that led Hitler to rise. And when everyone ended up just punishing Germany and everybody so much that led to Hitler, which was a whole nother thing. So he was prescient in certain ways, even though he got in his own way. And that's what I want to end with here. And I'm 2 minutes over, so I want to make sure I make this quick. I'm cognizant of that effect for my fellow host. I think that it's fascinating to me that here's this man who was so talented, and we could talk about Wilson for like 6 episodes, but was so talented and so brilliant in so many ways, could just trip himself up with his own inability to compromise or to see truths. And the League of Nations he got the League of Nations is basically kind of point one in his 14 points in Europe, but it had to be passed because it was a treaty, which is a check and balance, which thank God it wasn't an executive agreement, which they do today, which is totally wrong. But it was a treaty, and it had to be ratified by the Senate. And there was a senator who didn't want to do it. He didn't want to ratify the League of Nations because a lot of Americans said, we don't want to get involved in European things in this League of Nations. But they made compromises, from my understanding, and said eventually they would pass in the Senate the League of Nations. But Woodrow Wilson said, no, I'm not going to make any compromises. And you either do it my way or forget it. And so because he wouldn't compromise on the League of Nations with the Senate, according to the Constitution, he lost his League of Nations. So I think that says a lot about his character, and the Light Withdrawn, because he lost his entire big goal, which was the League of Nations. And I might have that wrong, but I'm hoping
No,
I don't.
I think you've got that exactly right. And exacerbating this was the fact that he had this really crippling stroke, which had a lot of effects on him, including personality. He was always stubborn, but his stubbornness was really enhanced as a result of this tragic medical situation he found himself in. So here we find ourselves in March 1920. The Senate's been haggling for months on the wording of so-called mild reservations to the treaty and the League Covenant. Reservations, unlike treaty amendments, didn't require a renegotiation with other countries. That had been Wilson's strongest argument against any amendment to the treaty, but these weren't amendments, just reservations that the Allies had actually pre-agreed to. So this agreement in the Senate that Democrats had negotiated in Wilson's behalf only awaited Wilson's blessing. And Wilson was promised by his press secretary at Versailles, Ray Baker, that he'd have everyone on his side if he went along with this. These were just minor, non-consequential changes. If you don't take them, you might get no treaty and no league. Wilson heard the same thing from Senator Gilbert Hitchcock, who was the leader of the Senate Democrats. They all urged him to do this. Wilson did the opposite. He told Hitchcock to draft a letter for presidential signature that urged Democrats to vote no on the treaty with reservations. And on March 19th, 23 Democrats who favored the treaty voted against it, following Wilson's instructions. 35 Republicans voted for it. Senator Hitchcock told the president afterward it had taken an extraordinary effort to convince his Democratic colleagues who supported the treaty to vote it down. So just as you say, Wilson had killed his own creation.
I need to toss. I'm really late, but can you answer this in like 15 seconds? Do you think, when you talked about the fact he was under a stroke, do you think that was because he wasn't really making those decisions when regarding to the compromise? Because he obviously fought for those compromises to be able to be incorporated when he was in Europe with the 14 points. So do you think he really made that decision, or was someone else making those decisions?
Yes, we know that he did, because his second wife, Edith, now the First Lady, allowed Hitchcock to actually come in and meet with him. And she was trying to facilitate this. And Wilson was very stubborn and dictated this letter for Hitchcock to take to the Senate.
But he had a stroke at that point, so he might not be thinking. He might not.
Yes, he was definitely medically impaired.
Okay. Well, Mr. Cox, thanks for debating with me back and forth. I respect your book. I respect your that you're shedding light on the pros and cons. I think that's really, really important. So thanks for our friendly debate today. And I look forward to I encourage everyone to check out your book, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. And thanks for doing this. I think it's really important. As a woman suffragist who's written a book of and a Broadway play about women fighting for women's rights. You enlightened me today, and I appreciate that. And thanks for sharing all these things with us, and thanks for being willing to debate with me.
No, not really. We're just hashing through a lot of old stuff here, but we've got
Well, yeah, we had to do it.
we've got Women's History Month coming up in March, so
Yes,
this is a
we
great
got that
topic to
right.
keep
We
at.
now understand. You corrected me there. So thank you so much. Appreciate your debate and your book, and thanks for being on the show with us today. And it just had to be so back and forth quick because I have to share. So I'm sharing now and I'm tossing. Okay, thanks so much.
You bet.
Thank you, Janine. I'm going to jump to Jewel.
Hello, this is Jewel Gilbert. Thank you so much for being on today, learning so much. So we've talked about Woodrow Wilson before, and there's so much to learn. You've already taught our audience and me so much. I have a question about question. It's not directly about what you may cover in the book about sex and race, but as far as it's hard for me to understand Wilson's political ideology as someone who is celebrated by modern progressives and as someone who and then a little bit later we also see a Teddy Roosevelt character when there's who is a different kind of progressive, I guess. So when we're talking about Woodrow Wilson, what was he someone who was just in favor of a progressive, powerful, institutional government? Like it's hard to dial down on what he really believed in, since we see that he's definitely in favor of a strong government. He was in favor of global initiatives. But beyond that, for a modern mind, how do we understand Wilson's political philosophy as we see is this, so that we can understand then what you're saying maybe about these other things more clearly?
Yeah. As I was mentioning, I think to our 21st century minds, this admixture of white supremacism, and Wilson surely was a white supremacist and appointed many of them to his cabinet, on the one hand, and other more traditional aspects of progressivism on the other, seem a very uncomfortable fit. And how is that possible? At the same time, we have the question of Wilson's approach to the scope and responsibilities of government, and what the federal government in particular should be doing. As a Southern Democrat, he was a states' rights man in many respects, and feared federal enforcement when it came to race. On the other hand, in other respects, he was for a very expansive federal role if it was carrying out policies that he approved of. We can go back and look through Wilson's academic years, and he spent most of his career as an academic and creating a written work product that we can infer a great deal from. He wrote, for example, about the separation of powers, and it was one of his hobby horses going all the way back to his college days, then through his early teaching days before he returned to the College of New Jersey, subsequently renamed Princeton University, and then ultimately became president of Princeton University, that the legislature, the federal legislature, the Congress, was too powerful. He believed that Congress, as designed by the Constitution, was despotic and dangerous. And to remedy this fundamental constitutional defect, Wilson proposed that the leaders of Congress report to the executive in the way that in Britain members of parliament serve the prime minister as cabinet officers. The president's cabinet members would sit in Congress, take the place of congressional committees, control the introduction of legislation. Wilson's proposal, which he first concocted when he was a college senior, would have prevented Congress from enacting Reconstruction over Andrew Johnson's vetoes. And that was his lived experience that he was rebelling against. The idea that this domineering Republican Congress forced black voting on the white South. That was a consistent theme throughout his life. So in these ways, his views on race help explain his views on the structure of government, his views on progressivism versus states' rights, and so on.
That's so interesting. I think that really clicks some things together of understanding Wilson's ideals. In a modern, I do still see those. Although we're saying that it's hard to look back and see, for our mind to understand, I still do see us today as well being able to hold some of these, like thoughts that are almost a dichotomy to each other in a lot of movements. But instead of going there, I want to ask you about a quick question that maybe it's not an easy answer, but I've never viewed Wilson as truly respecting the Constitution or natural law or the principles that the country was founded on. Do you think that that's not quite it, that's not quite right? I viewed Wilson as somewhat wanting to, that it's like he respected the institutions of America, but it was like he wanted to improve them so much that it wouldn't be that they wouldn't actually carry the same principles that they were founded with. So do you think that's kind of a not correct, and that in his mind he really did believe in the Constitution and the principles of the country's founding?
Well, he directly attacked in writing, first in a short monograph, ultimately in a long book-length collection of his speeches, the American constitutional system. He believed that the way it was designed, the role that it gave to the executive in lawmaking was insufficient. Wilson contended that the executive should have powers that go well beyond vetoing bad laws. The president should also be given an opportunity to make laws. Furthermore, the president should be the leader of his party and the guide of the nation. And while he lamented that the Constitution doesn't specify these roles, Wilson went further and argued that the successful activist president need not allow a mechanical theory of the Constitution's limitations on executive power to get in the way.
Okay, so I'm not too wrong then.
I mean,
So
I'm just telling you what he wrote.
yes,
So,
yes,
so I think we have a good
yeah.
idea of what Wilson thought about these things.
And then why? So at the time, I don't know if this is a great question, but why was Wilson elected? Why did he stay in power? And what did people, when he was president, do we know, what did the American people like about what he was doing?
So Wilson was amazingly fortunate in his supernova of a political career. He went in the space of 2 years from academia to the White House, with a very brief stop for half a term as a New Jersey governor along the way. His election as governor of New Jersey coincided in 1910 with a statewide and nationwide Democratic year, and timing is everything in politics. The Democrats in New Jersey were smarting from a string of losses to Republicans, and there was in the ascendancy this progressive movement that had as one of its tenets, eliminating corruption in politics. And here was an academic with no record in politics whatsoever, who was therefore squeaky clean, hadn't done any political deals, just the kind of person they would like. And because he did not have a voting record or a record as an executive, he could adopt all of the positions du jour that would be ideal for that particular election year. So that timing for Woodrow Wilson worked out perfectly. He didn't need to campaign. He got the Democratic nomination thanks to the party bosses who were more than willing to put up for nomination a man that none of the delegates at the convention had ever met. So Wilson then runs pretty much a silent campaign. The bosses tell him to sort of keep quiet. We'll use your writings to talk about what you stand for and so on. Then when he runs for the Democratic nomination for president, shortly afterward, almost immediately begins a campaign for the White House. He finds himself as a sort of hybrid northerner southerner, a southerner in the sense that he was born in Virginia, raised in Georgia, and then South Carolina, and then North Carolina, really till he was about 28 years old and got his first job, first full-time job in Pennsylvania. He was a southerner, and southerners looked at him that way. And yet Northerners knew that he had been governor of New Jersey, of course, but he'd also been on the Princeton faculty in New Jersey for a very long time, and then president of the university. So at the convention, there was a rule in place that you needed 2/3 of the vote. Tammany Hall had supported the Speaker of the House, Champ Clark, and he had a majority on a dozen ballots, but couldn't get to that 2/3, so they had to look for a compromise candidate. And here was this guy who was not everybody's first choice, but he was at least acceptable to Northerners. They knew something about him. He was a neighbor. And Southerners who were quite certain he was one of them. Then come to the general election, and he has the incredible good fortune of running against not one, but two Republican presidents, William Howard Taft, the incumbent, and Theodore Roosevelt, the immediately prior incumbent, who had bolted the Republican convention that year after narrowly losing the nomination to Taft, and started his own Bull Moose Progressive Party, essentially as a third party. So these two Republican presidents get a majority of the popular vote, and Wilson skates into the White House with 42%. Then in 1916, you asked, how did he get reelected? Why was he popular, and so on? That turns out to have been one of the closest elections in American history. And he won as the peace candidate who promised to keep America out of World War I. He won the election. Ultimately, it all came down to California. Took all week to hand count votes. And the winner of California was going to be president. In the final analysis, Wilson won with 3,421 votes. Quite a squeaker. And then within weeks of being sworn in, he asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany.
Wow, what a concise and fascinating retelling of that political rise. It boils down to a progressive academic that wasn't a big fan of the Constitution becoming a president even that long ago. So I got to pass to Wyatt, who is a history buff, and I'm going to look forward to the questions he's going to ask. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Wyatt Hensley here. Thank you, Congressman, for being on. This is also fascinating because even when I was learning about U.S. history, always hearing these conflicting arguments for and against Wilson. I just wanted to quickly ask, kind of to bounce off of the last question. You said that he was the peace candidate, how he was saying that he wasn't going to send our men over to Europe. Did he have a hunch that, though, there was a big possibility that we would get involved? Or was he just telling that to get elected?
Wilson confided to a handful of people before the election that it was very clear that the United States would sooner or later have to get in this war. And he told an editor of the New York World off the record that really we should be in now. He told his chief of staff, then called the White House secretary, that we will be in the war. I just can't tell the American people now. And so he saw it coming. And of course, it had been coming for a long time. The sinking of the Lusitania was, more than a year before. And so, thousands of Americans were dying. The attacks on merchant shipping, it had ebbed and flowed, but this had been going on for a long time. Ultimately, we now know from many texts that were released after the war that Germany read Wilson's, fairly stark declarations of pacifism as an assurance that America would be, unable to put together a force in sufficient time if they did enter the war to stop Germany from accomplishing its objectives over the next 6 months. So they read America's pacifism as not just a sign of weakness, but an invitation. And it really made inevitable America getting into the war.
Yeah, Very, very interesting. Also another one, just to clarify, so whenever he was running for president, was he a vocal about his stance of women's rights, about an opponent of women's rights? Was he pretty vocal about that, or?
No, to the contrary, he talked about it as little as possible. He really attempted to be friendly to all. There were organized groups of what were called antis or antis, people opposed to, and largely these were women's groups, opposed to women voting. Uh, he wanted to cultivate support from them as well as from groups like the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And he did a really good job of it. It's a remarkable political performance. He kept them both on a string throughout the reelect in 1916. I don't know that too many politicians could pull it off, but he did. He did meet with delegations in the White House. He met with delegations of both pro and anti-suffragists. He ultimately lost his cool in some of those meetings, particularly with Alice Paul's group, because they were quite forward in saying, we want you to do something specific. We want you to mention the Anthony Amendment in one of your addresses to Congress, which he refused to do. So he got fed up with them and, sort of was angry with himself for it, as he was when he blew his top when civil rights protesters came in and complained about segregation. He very famously threw William Monroe Trotter out of his office and told him he'd never be welcome in the White House again. And then later, to one of his cabinet members, confided, I shouldn't have said that. I should have just said I would take it all under submission and we would have never heard of it again. So, mostly what he tried to do was that he tried to keep a low profile on an issue that he really didn't believe in, but also did not want to, take on any political water for.
Wow. Yeah, man, yeah, that's very interesting. All of his maneuvering and all, very fascinating. So especially like after the stroke, you were saying that his wife was there helping facilitate some of these conversations. Did she influence him at all on his political beliefs and maybe some of the work that his administration did?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's come up, anew in 2024 when people were wondering how much Jill Biden was involved in Joe Biden's decisions and so on. But the Edith Wilson story, and the Woodrow Wilson disability, are much more stark. Entire books have been written about this, and it's fascinating to speculate about whether, Edith Bowling Galt Wilson was the first woman president, or the Machiavellian first lady who secretly manipulates the federal government while her husband's incapacitated, or some kind of female Rasputin who convinces the helpless invalid to agree to her plans for the country. Edith Wilson, I think, can be criticized for other things, which I can go into, but I would absolve her of being a power-hungry, illegitimate president operating in the shadows. I say this because that's not what she did. First and foremost, she was concerned about the president's health. And so what she did was keep work away from him. Her great sin was keeping the truth away from the American people. And of course, the reality of what had happened to Wilson was far worse than anyone in Washington, let alone the rest of the country, could imagine.
Yeah, that's man. Yeah, because I mean, obviously, I'd heard about Edith Wilson and her position with President Wilson. It's just really fascinating to hear the people make that argument that, she was the first woman president. Um, then one last question, let me get to it. So you're talking about Wilson's background of education, and if I'm not mistaken, he's the only president with a PhD, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, so how did his education and his education background kind of influence him politically?
Well, for better or for worse, Wilson had an education as a graduate student at Johns Hopkins under the tutelage of German-trained professors who were steeped in the European theory of Aryan supremacy, white supremacy. They viewed history and politics through a racial lens. And this view of white males, and particularly Aryan, if you will, that's what they called them, white males being uniquely endowed with the character and judgment and intelligence needed to run governments. This is something that melded with what Wilson already thought when he came to Johns Hopkins, because he had grown up as a child of the Civil War and then a teenager during Reconstruction, and had learned along with other Southern Democrats, his own family and neighbors, to hate what Congress had forced on the South. Black voting, Black people in elected office, Black people in the state legislature and Congress and so on. Reconstruction, which ministered to the formerly enslaved population, which provided education, job training, food, all of these things. Wilson wrote about when he was at Princeton. He said that this was really awful, that it was made for the ruin of the South, and so on. So when he got to Johns Hopkins and was hearing from these professors, one of whom was trained under a very famous German named Bluntschli, and the seminar room that Wilson studied in was the Bluntschli Library. Bluntschli had argued against reparations to the United States after the Civil War because the Civil War battleships that the Confederates used were provided by the British. He said what the South was fighting for in the Civil War was the historical right, that they had every right to their property, which was human. And then he wrote a textbook after the Civil War, years after it was over. And he said that even though the war is over, even though slavery's been abolished, Black people should not be allowed to vote because they lack fundamentally the capacity. And this book, called The Theory of the State, was used in Wilson's courses at Johns Hopkins. Wilson then wrote his own book, very much based on Bluntschli's work, called The State. And in Wilson's book, he organizes all the world's governments according to race, with the Aryans on top. Semitic peoples, he said, must come below. And then there are people like Asians and so on, who we don't need to study because they are not the fittest in the evolutionary scheme. So that's the kind of influence, first, that his own education had on him, and then through his writings that he published when he was an academic at Princeton, that he had on other people.
Man, yeah, fascinating. Yeah, so not only did he grow up with that mentality of hearing all this, but it solidified in his education too. That's just very fascinating. Well, thank you so much. I am completely out of time, so I will pass it on. Thank you, Congressman.
You
Thank you,
bet.
Yeah,
Wyatt.
and
Thank
I'd love to step in for just 2 seconds, and I've got to toss to Kathy. So Mr. Cox, if you could make this like 60-second answer, that there was a hero. The African Americans fought in World War I, and it was very inspiring for them, and they felt empowered, and they were proud to fight for America. From what I've gleaned from what I've learned. And there was a particular man, I don't remember his name, who was a hero of taking on the Germans. I mean, he got up there like, an action hero, Sylvester Stallone, and went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It took care of like 8, 9 Germans surrounding him. And he became a hero, and he was written about all in the press. He was a hero in America. And the sad and terrible thing were the uprisings against the African Americans after the war, who had fought for the country and had been so heroic. And this one man was an absolute hero, and he was put on a train and they walked into the train and killed him when he arrived into the town during these riots, and Wilson supposedly did nothing about it. And that is really, really, it's all so much about what he did was horrible, but that's a particularly horrible story. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, and I should add that there were many more. I mean, Harlem Hellfighters, all sorts of.
Well, can you just stick with that one? Can you just stick with that one? and I got to toss to Kathy, but I mean, that particular story, don't tell me more, but that particular story, this is Janine Turner speaking, by the way, but I mean, that's a really terrible tragedy, what happened, and that he had his strokes, but he didn't step up to stop this uprising against the heroic African Americans who'd fought in World War I, that he didn't step up to protect them, and that this hero was killed inside the train. Can you just speak to that in literally like 30 seconds, please? So I'm not in trouble with Kathy.
Yes. So while Wilson was over in Europe, race riots were building in the United States, and ultimately we had what was called the Red Summer. It started in Washington, D.C., spread to Chicago, then cities across the country, and many African American men, women, children were killed. Heroes such as you mentioned, many of them who had fought in World War I for their country. And Wilson never spoke to this. The NAACP leaders of civil rights movements across the country would put open letters to the president in newspapers and so on. But privately, he said, I don't know what I could say.
Yeah, I find that to be quite horrific. And the African Americans were fighting for America, that they were fighting for America and and they were so proud and so happy
really
and so
awful.
happy to be Americans. And then that terrible uprising that happened, and that hero who was just, I don't know what happened to him exactly in the train, but anyhow, yeah, well, there's a light withdrawn on Woodrow Wilson. Okay, I'm tossing to Kathy. There you go, Kathy.
Thank you, Janine, and thank you to all of our great panelists today. We want to take a minute and recognize our teachers and students who are watching today. We have D'Angela Hines with the Emerald Coast Christian Academy watching with 34 students. We have Kenyon Wanis, a homeschooled student watching. And we have Professor Alex Tokarov with many students on today with Northwood University. So thank you to all the teachers and students who are joining us. We also want to thank our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats on Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to everyone listening in Las Vegas. So Congressman Cox, we've got lots of great audience questions, but I'm going to start here with Professor Tokarov, who says what is not explicitly delegated to the government and the Constitution is forbidden for them to do. How did SCOTUS miss the obvious fact when they allowed Wilson to create his federal agencies and make laws outside of Congress? And will today's Supreme Court of the United States abolish all of them after striking down Chevron?
Yeah, the general welfare clause of the Constitution has often been cited as the great catch-all, if you will, for the exercise of federal government powers that are not enumerated in the Constitution. It's been a source of debate throughout our constitutional history, and obviously there has been along the way quite an accretion of federal authority and power and involvement in various aspects of American life that might not have been contemplated from the relatively skimpy list in the Constitution. But that is the modern government, and why precisely it has come about that way is an awfully long and complicated tale of different justices on the court, different times, and unique cases. What the current court will do and in what context and what cases, not entirely clear, but there does seem to be, at least in the zeitgeist, a moment where we're noticing that what is called the administrative state, which ties a lot of this to Woodrow Wilson because he would have called it that too, and he would not have meant it as a pejorative, that the administrative state raises a lot of these questions because agencies such as the one that I ran, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the Environmental Protection Agency, or what have you, FCC, these are thought to be independent agencies. And so independent of what? And if they are independent of the executive, does that mean we have a fourth branch of government? So these are the kinds of questions that I do think we will increasingly see the Supreme Court's relatively recent overturning of the Chevron doctrine, which deferred to independent agencies as interpreters of the law, put the courts back in charge of saying what the law says, and they will no longer defer to what independent agencies say. So I think that's a sign of the direction that things presently are headed in. But of course, with the Supreme Court, justices often don't turn out to do the things that the people who appointed them expect them to do. They're people and they change. So we don't even know, even if we do know who's on the court, we don't really know what they're going to do.
Well, thank you. And we are right at the top of the hour. So we thank you so much for being with us today. It was a really enlightening episode. And thank you to our panelists and thank you to our audience. And we ask that everyone joins us next week as we're going to be starting our Day in the Life series. And we're going to start with a day in the life of an assistant to the president. We're going to find out from a former assistant to the president and the first Trump administration, what it's like to be an assistant to the president, what these different assistants to the presidents do. And looking forward to delving into that. So thank you again. And we encourage everyone to go out and buy Congressman Cox's book. So
Well, thank you for that. And I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.